Solicitor General, you may proceed.
It was Saturday, June 26, 1971, at the Supreme Court of the United States in Washington.
Mr. Chief Justice, may I say...
Solicitor General Erwin Griswold argued for the Nixon administration in the momentous First Amendment case, the New York Times Company versus the United States. Griswold's aim was to stop the Times from continuing to publish secrets revealed in the Pentagon Papers.
The publication of the material specified in my closed brief will, as I have tried to argue, materially affect the security of the United States. It will affect lives. It will affect the process of the termination of the war.
Attorney Alexander Bickel represented the New York Times.
Having read the submissions of the government, I am flatly persuaded that there's nothing that would meet my standard in there for a statute or for independent executive action. Because if there were, it surely should have turned up by now.
The government insisted the Pentagon Papers contained secrets that, if published, would directly harm U.S. national security. Bickel pushed for clarification. Which secret documents specifically were at issue?
Please show me now, which are the 3, which are the 5, which are the 10, which is the most important of these?
The Washington Post was represented by William Glendon.
Well, Your Honor, the government came into court. They suspended the First Amendment. They stopped us from printing.
The case revolved around the legal concept known as prior restraint, essentially censorship, which carried a heavy burden of proof by the government.
I understand it. When you bring a case, you're supposed to prove it. And when you come in claiming irreparable injury, particularly in this area of the First Amendment, you have a very, very heavy burden. And you're weighing here an abridgment of the First Amendment, the people's right to know.
The Supreme Court was to determine if court injunctions obtained by the Nixon administration violated the newspaper's freedom of speech.
And you're being asked to approve something that the government has never done before.
The High Court was considering court orders against the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Boston Globe. They were the only news organizations to publish articles based on the leaked Pentagon report before the injunctions were ordered. But Justice William Brennan asked the obvious question: were there others publishing?
Am I correct that the injunctions so far granted against the Times and the Post haven't stopped other newspapers from publishing materials?
It is my understanding that except with respect to the items in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Boston Globe, there has not been published anything else which is not covered by material already published.
Actually, that wasn't true. Others had run stories just the day before based on the Pentagon Papers.
Meanwhile, the Chicago Sun-Times said today, and the Baltimore Sun reported today, the Los Angeles Times, quoting from the secret report, said that when the Johnson administration ordered...
By the time of the Supreme Court hearing, more than a dozen other newspapers around the country had published reports based on the Pentagon Papers. Justice White pressed the government on this issue.
To the extent anything has been published and has already been revealed, the United States is not seeking an injunction against the further publication of that particular item.
No, Mr. Justice, I think that at that point we would agree that it becomes futile.
The injunctions were, in fact, becoming futile. Newspaper presses around the country were churning out stories based on leaks from Ellsberg. Then, on June 30th, 1971, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled.
In one of the most important judicial decisions in the history of the country,
the ruling was amazingly simple.
The Supreme Court today ruled that the New York Times and the Washington Post may continue to publish the secret.
Proving the need for prior censorship is a heavy burden, and the government didn't meet that burden.
Having lost the Supreme Court case against the newspapers, President Richard Nixon set his sights on Daniel Ellsberg. The key, Nixon declared privately, was to ruin Ellsberg's reputation.
We've got to go gung-ho now on this Ellsberg. You make a martyr out of him when we're going to give an incentive to every little son of a bitch in this government to run out of the place and rat on us.
Meanwhile, Daniel Ellsberg had no inkling how his decision to leak the Pentagon Papers would affect history.
Did I imagine that anything I did would have an effect on whether Nixon stayed in office? It didn't even enter my head. It turned out that it did.
The Ground Truth Podcast presents The Whistleblower, Truth, Dissent, and the Legacy of Daniel Ellsberg, a public history project in partnership with the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. I'm Charlie Sennett, founder of the Ground Truth Project. In June 1971, the New York Times began publishing reports based on secret documents obtained from former Pentagon insider Daniel Ellsberg. They became known as the Pentagon Papers. The 7,000-page study documented U.S. military and political involvement in Southeast Asia, dating back decades. It revealed that U.S. presidents had been lying for years about the extent of American activity in the region. Pentagon researcher Daniel Ellsberg leaked the report to the news media, believing that if Americans knew how they'd been deceived about the war by 4 previous administrations, they would demand that President Richard Nixon end the conflict. Nixon pledged to do so.
I can assure you tonight that American involvement in this war is coming to an end.
But he was actually following the same playbook, to fight on in Vietnam while lying to the American people. To mark the 50th anniversary of the release of the Pentagon Papers, this podcast series covers the sweep of Daniel Ellsberg's life, from a cold warrior to a truth teller. In this episode, we trace the series of events that tied Daniel Ellsberg's espionage trial to the fate of Richard Nixon's presidency. Just 2 days before the Supreme Court's landmark decision involving the Times and the Post, Daniel Ellsberg turned himself in at the federal courthouse in Boston. He was free on bail for now.
There had never been such a prosecution under the Espionage Act, under which I was indicted, or any other act. And I was indicted eventually on 12 felony counts of violations of the Espionage Act, theft, and conspiracy to defraud the government of its ability to classify information, which added up to a possible sentence of 115 years.
Even though Ellsberg faced life in prison, that wasn't enough to satisfy President Nixon. To explain that, we need to step back a couple of weeks to June 13th, 1971. From the very first day the Pentagon Papers were published, Nixon seemed dumbstruck.
It all relates, of course, to everything up until we came in. It's hard on Johnson. It's hard on Kennedy.
Republican Richard Nixon was used to the New York Times printing stories he felt were unflattering to him. But today, the paper he despised contained blistering reports about his Democratic predecessors, John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, and their mishandling of the war in Vietnam. Nixon didn't have to lift a finger.
Well, they have nothing from our administration.
Henry Kissinger, Nixon's national security advisor, saw opportunity.
So actually, I've read this stuff. We come out pretty well in it.
But once Ellsberg was indicted and facing a grand jury, Kissinger raised a bright red flag.
Because that son of a bitch, first of all, I know him well. He was my student.
Kissinger had been a Harvard University professor years earlier when Ellsberg was there doing graduate work.
I will bet that he has more information that he is saving for the trial, because he is a despicable bastard.
Nixon and Kissinger had reason to be concerned. The classified study of the government's failures in the Vietnam War was completed in 1968, almost a year before Nixon came to office. But Nixon and Kissinger didn't know whether Ellsberg also had other sensitive internal documents on Nixon's war policies. These would include the secret bombing of Cambodia in March 1969. So secret that only Nixon and Kissinger and a handful of military officials knew about it. Nixon's cabinet was in the dark. So were Congress and the American people. Kissinger became increasingly concerned about further leaks. At one point in the Oval Office, he called Ellsberg the most dangerous man in America, who must be stopped.
I just say that we've got to keep our eye on the main ball. The main ball's Ellsberg.
Nixon agreed.
We got to get this son of a bitch.
The first step was to indict him on felony charges. But even that wasn't going to be enough.
Chris Oppie is an historian and author. He says Nixon's henchmen didn't want to simply silence Daniel Ellsberg. They wanted to destroy his reputation.
So within days, or weeks, I would say, they're already plotting to go after him in extra-legal ways, really criminal ways, by forming this group called the Special Investigations Unit, which soon became dubbed the Plumbers.
The Plumbers would become famous a couple years later during the Watergate scandal, which involved a series of illegal political activities and cover-ups by President Nixon and his administration. But in 1971, the Plumbers' original work for the Nixon White House had to do with their moniker, The Plumbers were in charge of stopping leaks to Congress and the media. Daniel Ellsberg was their first target. Their work was to be secret, and Nixon was looking for a head plumber, someone he could trust.
Must be a man that I can call it. I want him accountable to anybody but me. I'm going to run this thing. But another thing, it's got to be a guy, Bob, that is totally trustworthy, because I've got to talk to him very frankly about things that we want to do. In other words, I don't want him to make a big record, go out and blast it like what the president ordered, you know what I mean?
And as far as the president was concerned, laws could be broken.
I don't give a shit about the law. I'm forget the law.
And as you can hear on this recording, dated July 1st, 1971, Nixon advisor Chuck Colson put forth a fateful candidate to be chief plumber, a man who would become famous for his role in the Watergate scandal.
There's one guy on the outside who might be able to do all of this. He spent 20 years in the CIA overthrowing governments. His name is Howard Hunt.
Chuck Colson had been given the assignment to use whatever information was obtained to discredit Dr. Ellsberg.
Bud Krogh was the White House staffer overseeing the Plumbers. He died in 2020. In this oral history interview from 2007, Krogh explains the reporting process.
Howard Hunt's job was to provide that information to Colson if and when it had been obtained by the unit.
With former CIA agent Howard Hunt in place, Bud Krogh then brought in former FBI agent G. Gordon Liddy to help with covert operations. Again, historian Chris Oppie.
They started hatching up all these plans, and they're the ones that thought they might really be able to get Ellsberg to blackmail him, in any case, to shut him up, prevent any possible future leaks.
On September 3rd, 1971, Hunt and Liddy flew to Los Angeles. They brought specialized espionage gear borrowed from the CIA. They had enlisted a crew of Cuban Americans who were told they were hired for a secret national security operation. The mission was to break into an office at 450 North Bedford Drive in Beverly Hills to obtain files related to Daniel Ellsberg. The office belonged to Dr. Lewis Fielding, Ellsberg's psychiatrist.
It's almost generally said that their purpose was to find information to smear me in the press. That's misleading or wrong. Their intention was to find information they could threaten me with revealing. Keeping my mouth shut was the aim, and simply threatening me with indictment, obviously, wasn't enough.
Bud Krogh had ordered the operation on President Nixon's behalf.
I do remember saying that the whole impetus for what we have been doing came directly out of the Oval Office. I felt that he had set the tone, the foundation for it by explaining to me and to Ehrlichman that what we were dealing with was the highest national security importance.
John Ehrlichman was Nixon's chief domestic advisor. Although Ehrlichman later denied having known of the burglary in advance, a memo dated August 11, 1971, clearly indicated the plan. Quote, "We would recommend that a covert operation be undertaken to examine all the medical files still held by Ellsberg's psychoanalyst." Ehrlichman's initial E approved the plan. Below his initial, he wrote the caveat, "If done under your assurance, it is not traceable." In this White House tape from a month later, Ehrlichman refers to the break-in during a meeting with President Nixon.
We had one little operation that aborted out in Los Angeles, which I think it's better that you don't know about. But we've got some dirty tricks underway that may pay off.
The little operation out in Los Angeles was aborted because it had been botched. In the end, they found nothing in the doctor's files. But Nixon's plumbers kept scheming up ways to get Ellsberg, really just to make him look unstable. One plan included lacing Ellsberg's soup with LSD at an event where he was speaking. One of several plans that failed, but there would be more. Meanwhile, the espionage case against Daniel Ellsberg and his friend Tony Russo was moving forward. Following their arraignment in Los Angeles in August, a grand jury heard testimony in preparation of indictments against the two. Russo was found in contempt of court for refusing to testify against Ellsberg. Russo spent 6 weeks in jail. Meanwhile, Ellsberg's ex-wife, Carol Cummings, testified before the grand jury. Here's their son, Robert Ellsberg.
Her hope all along was that by her testifying, again, that would prevent them from calling me as a witness. But that didn't happen.
Robert, then 15, was called as a witness because his dad had recruited him and his younger sister 2 years earlier to help make photocopies of the massive secret Pentagon Papers report.
The FBI came to the door and they said to my mother, "I'm sorry, but Robert has been subpoenaed before the grand jury." Well, when? Today. This was early in the morning, I guess, before I went to school. My mother contacted my father to tell him that I had been subpoenaed. And when I spoke to him, he didn't let on to me how upset he was that this was happening. He just said, "Well, of course, you'll tell the truth." So we had to go downtown to the courthouse in Los Angeles. And so that's what happened, and that's what I did.
By the end of 1971, Daniel Ellsberg and Tony Russo were finally indicted for theft and espionage. Ellsberg faced 12 felony charges and a possible 115 years in prison. But false starts, a mistrial, and judicial reviews would delay the trial for a full year. April 1972. The war in Vietnam shows no sign of ending.
I have ordered that our air and naval attacks on military installations in North Vietnam be continued until the North Vietnamese stop their offensive in South Vietnam.
Daniel Ellsberg's goal of trying to end the war by leaking the Pentagon Papers seemed hopeless. Still awaiting trial, Ellsberg continued to speak out against the war at protests around the country. On May 3, 1972, Ellsberg addressed a rally in Washington. It ended in pandemonium. Hecklers shouted, "Traitor." Fistfights broke out among some of the attendees. It was later revealed that the hecklers were hired in yet another White House covert operation to discredit Ellsberg. Just a few weeks later, the Plumbers made headlines.
Illegal bugging apparently was one aim of a team which broke into the Democratic National Headquarters in Washington during the weekend, and the political background...
This was the first hint of what would later become known as the Watergate scandal. Meanwhile, President Nixon was focused on his campaign for re-election in November.
Tonight, I again proudly accept your nomination for President of the United States.
By the end of the summer of 1972, Richard Nixon was leading Democratic presidential candidate George McGovern by more than 20 percentage points. And in October, Henry Kissinger delivered a message of hope on the Vietnam War.
We believe that peace is at hand. We believe that an agreement is within sight.
The United States had been meeting secretly in Paris with representatives of North Vietnam to seek peace. For months, the talks went nowhere. But on the eve of the 1972 presidential election, Kissinger revealed a breakthrough.
We believe that by far the longest part of the road has been traversed.
Indicates the president re-elected by a landslide. 121 electoral votes for President Nixon, who won 49 states.
So people voted a landslide after an election in which Kissinger had said, "Peace is at hand," knowing that they were going to do the greatest bombing in human history weeks after the election.
Over 12 days and nights during the Christmas season of 1972, U.S. warplanes dropped more than 20,000 tons of bombs on North Vietnam.
By the end of 72, it appeared that nothing I had done or anyone else had done had had any effect on the war. Not the civil disobedience, not the Pentagon Papers, which had come out a year before, and now in December, the Christmas bombing.
Nixon do solemnly swear. I, Richard Nixon, do solemnly swear.
Just 3 days after his second inauguration, President Nixon made a surprise announcement on primetime television. It was January 23rd, 1973.
That we today have concluded an agreement to end the war and bring peace with honor in Vietnam.
The peace accords in Paris had produced a truce. The North Vietnamese troops that were in the South could remain. The United States would not resume the bombing as long as a ceasefire remained. But the war was not over. The only thing that was clear was that the remaining U.S. troops would be coming home. Meanwhile, Daniel Ellsberg and Tony Russo's trial was underway in Los Angeles, where the copying first took place. A year and a half had passed since Americans had first heard of Daniel Ellsberg. Now the public's attention had turned away from the Pentagon Papers case. Ellsberg and Russo's defense presented witness after witness, including officials from previous administrations. Meanwhile, fundraisers around the country attempted to defray Ellsberg's court costs, which were substantial.
It was more than $1,000 a day in those dollars just for transcripts and for other costs. It was an expensive process.
By April, defense funds had dried up. It would only be a matter of days until the defense had to rest. Ellsberg and Russo's fates would be up to the jury. But there was one more fundraiser to go.
It was on April 7th, 1973, and my birthday. It was, I think, Barbra Streisand's first political action.
The legendary actress and singer Barbra Streisand had previously expressed support for the defense, so the fundraisers asked if they could use her house for an event.
And she said, "You don't want me to sing?" And I said, "Well, we thought that would be too intimate, asking too much." She said, "It's a lot more intimate to ask me for my house than to ask me to sing."
The fundraiser was actually held at a movie producer's house in Hollywood. Joni Mitchell was there, so were the Beatles.
So it was put on as an auction of her singing. She had a large volume of popular songs that she had sung and an accompanist. And people would ask her to do a song and bid so much for it, for the fundraising. And she would do it just accompanied by the piano.
Streisand sang Happy Birthday to Ellsberg. Then she asked for Ellsberg's favorite song. It was one Streisand had recorded. She sang it to Ellsberg and his wife, Patricia.
"What are you doing the rest of your life? What are you doing the rest of your life? North and south and east and west of your life." Da-da-da, and so forth. "All I want the best of your life is to spend it all with you." Patricia and I we thought of that as our song.
At that time, Ellsberg might have imagined he would be spending the rest of his life not with Patricia, but alone and behind bars. But after Streisand's fundraiser, he had reason to be hopeful.
She raised $50,000, which in those days was a very large amount, and it kept the trial going at least another month.
The significance of this fundraiser is difficult to overstate. Had Ellsberg's trial ended, a string of revelations might not have come to light. These revelations would be devastating to Richard Nixon, and the president knew it. Before we get to these revelations, it's important to know what's happening at the same time in the Watergate investigation. In January of 1973, the 5 men arrested for breaking into Democratic National Committee headquarters were sentenced for their roles in the break-in 6 months earlier. So were G. Gordon Liddy and Howard Hunt. When Hunt was asked whether the Plumbers had been involved in any illegal activity prior to the Watergate break-in, he said no. That was a lie. Hunt knew he had led the break-in to Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office, and he knew that was against the law. But that was hardly the end of it. In February, the Senate established a select committee on presidential campaign activities. By March of 1973, the Watergate investigators were beginning to subpoena Nixon's staff, who were being implicated in the scandal.
There's no doubt about the seriousness of the problem we've got. We have a cancer close to the presidency that's growing.
On March 21st, White House counsel John Dean laid it out for the president. At this point, G. Gordon Liddy was in prison for refusing to testify, and Howard Hunt had been successfully bribed by the White House to continue to lie in court. But Hunt was demanding further payment, warning that he could implicate Nixon's close advisor, John Ehrlichman, and Nixon aide, Bud Krogh.
He says, "I will bring John Ehrlichman down to his knees and put him in jail. I have done enough seamy things for he and Krogh that they'll never survive it." Ellsberg and apparently some other things. I don't know the full extent of it. The Cubans that were used in the Watergate were also the same Cubans that Hunt and Liddy used for this California Ellsberg thing, the break-in out there.
Meaning the burglary at Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office. How much of this was news to Nixon is unclear, but it was clear that Dean knew enough of the details that if he were called to testify, he would reveal that Howard Hunt committed perjury. On April 15, 1973, John Dean did meet with Watergate investigators. His testimony was a fatal blow to Nixon's attempt to nail Ellsberg and remain in office.
John's testimony, exactly when it came, had enormous effect on events. It resulted in bringing Hunt back to the grand jury after he had perjured himself and said, as he was supposed to, he did not know of any prior crimes by the White House except the Watergate.
Once Nixon was told about Dean's testimony, he delayed sending a memo to Judge Byrne that would reveal the break-in at the psychiatrist's office. After the Justice Department forced his hand, Nixon tried to influence the judge's decision to reveal it in court.
I don't know how you can get this to the judge, but I think it's very important for him to know that the national security investigation of the highest importance.
Judge Byrne wasn't buying the president's veil of national security.
In Los Angeles today, federal judge Matt Byrne interrupted testimony at the Pentagon Papers trial with a dramatic announcement. Byrne said he had received a memorandum from the Justice Department stating that two Watergate conspirators, Howard Hunt and Gordon Liddy, had burglarized the offices of Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist.
The memo contained more details of the Plumbers' dirty tricks, including one plot to physically assault Ellsberg.
Watergate conspirators, Liddy and Hunt, started harassing Daniel Ellsberg as early as last May, supposedly hiring thugs to beat up Ellsberg and disrupt fundraising rallies.
It was then revealed that Nixon attempted to bribe the presiding judge.
Washington White House officials say that Judge Byrne has been sounded out as a possible new FBI chief. In court, the judge confirmed that he secretly visited San Clemente last month to talk with John Ehrlichman about a government
Despite these developments, Judge Byrne continued to deny the defense's motion to dismiss the case. But when it was revealed that illegal wiretaps ordered by Kissinger had picked up Ellsberg's conversations, the judge had seen enough. It was time to declare a mistrial.
The trial was ended by the judge on the grounds of a totality of circumstances so bizarre as to offend a sense of justice. He threw out the charges with prejudice, meaning I couldn't be tried again on those charges.
Just a month earlier, it looked like Russo and Ellsberg's fate would be up to the jury. But then Barbra Streisand stepped up with her Hollywood fundraiser.
Had we not gotten that money and gone on, then Dean's revelation on April 15th that the Oval Office had ordered a burglary of my former psychiatrist's office, it would not have come out in court or at all, and Nixon would probably have stayed in office because that was a key crime that was traced directly to the Oval Office.
It was a remarkable turn of events for the country. Within a month of the trial's end, Congress passed a veto-proof law which set a deadline of August 15th to end direct U.S. military action in Vietnam. Over the coming months, President Nixon's White House was completely crippled by the ongoing revelations of wrongdoing in the Watergate affair. Congress learned that Nixon had been secretly recording his conversations in the White House and on the telephone. Nixon tried to keep the tapes private. July 1974. The U.S. Supreme Court weighed in. Although 4 of the 9 justices were Nixon appointees, their ruling was unanimous. The president must turn over the tapes. Instead, Richard Nixon stepped down on August 9th, 1974.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
Nixon's obsession with destroying Daniel Ellsberg's character would ultimately destroy his own presidency. Again, historian Chris Oppie.
It's not the Pentagon Papers themselves that brought down Nixon. What brought down Nixon was his massive overreaction to the Pentagon Papers. There's a direct line from the overreaction to the Pentagon Papers to the first serious, verifiable crimes of Watergate that are directly linked not just to the White House, but to Nixon himself. He's got his fingerprints all over the criminal actions of the Plumbers who were attacking Ellsberg. And he understood that.
The United States provided arms and financial support to South Vietnam until April 30th, 1975, with the fall of Saigon, 4 years after Ellsberg leaked the Pentagon Papers.
Although the Pentagon Papers themselves did not affect Nixon's policy, and the war actually expanded after the Pentagon Papers came out, the criminal actions that the White House took against me were extraordinarily revealed in ways that no one foresaw. And my wife and I think of ourselves as part of a chain of events which actually led to this absolutely unforeseeable downfall of a president, which made the war endable. So they did, in fact, contribute. So it showed that truth-telling could be effective.
In the end, Ellsberg's case was dismissed before a jury could rule on his guilt or innocence. And for 2 years, Nixon attempted to smear him in the press, calling him a thief, a traitor, who gave aid and comfort to the enemy. As Daniel Ellsberg remembers, it wasn't until a few weeks after his case was ended that he really got a sense of how the court of public opinion regarded him.
We were invited by one of the senators to come to the Watergate hearings. So we arrive, we come into the Capitol, the rotunda, and we see people waiting to go up in the hearing room. And as we came into the center of the rotunda, people started to applaud and cheer at that moment, all of them, in a spiral that goes up to the dome, practically, of the Capitol. And that was a thrilling moment, absolutely. But Patricia and I will never forget that.
In the next episode, before he had anything to do with the Pentagon Papers, Daniel Ellsberg worked as a nuclear planner. He amassed a trove of documents that he had stashed away, with plans to release them while in prison. These documents were, in many ways, more damaging and more sensitive even today than the Pentagon Papers. Over the course of our year of working with Ellsberg, he opened up about the importance of his documents on nuclear planning, or as he calls it, the doomsday machine.
What I'm about to say could put me in prison if I live long enough. By the way, you're recording it, I presume?
Did you miss the Ellsberg conference marking the 50 years since Ellsberg leaked the Pentagon Papers? You can still watch the conversations at ellsbergpapers.org. You can also find the link in the podcast description on your app. Tell us what you think of this podcast and tell your friends they can find the Whistleblower series on their favorite podcast app. The senior producer of the Ground Truth podcast is Mitch Hanley. We had editorial help from Stephen Smith. Marketing and promotion by Maggie Taylor and Ground Truth's Josh Coe. The University of Massachusetts at Amherst made the historic acquisition of Daniel Ellsberg's papers in 2019. That archive is now curated at the W.E.B. Du Bois Library. Special thanks to Professor Christian Oppie in the History Department, Professor Kathy Roberts-Ford in the Journalism Program, and Jeremy Smith, Ellsberg Archivist at the Special Collections and University Archives. This season of the Ground Truth podcast was made possible through the generous support of the UMass Chancellor's Office. This has been a year-long public history project in partnership with the University of Massachusetts at Amherst and in collaboration with GBH in Boston, where the Ground Truth Project is based. I'm Charlie Sennett, founder of the Ground Truth Project. I want to tell you about another podcast I think you'll like. The Last Archive from Harvard historian and New Yorker writer Jill Lepore. This season, Lepore is investigating purveyors of doubt, hoaxers, fraudsters, pseudoscientists, and how the peddling of doubt evolved over the 20th century, leading all the way to the Capitol insurrection on January 6th. This show is unlike anything you've heard before. History animated by long-lost archival tapes and documents, intrepid reporting, and radio drama reenactments. The Last Archive unfurls like a classic 1930s gumshoe mystery, but takes on the big issues of today. How do we know what we know? And why does it seem sometimes, lately, as if we don't know anything at all. Listen to The Last Archive wherever you get your podcasts from Pushkin Industries.